Imagine for a moment what it meant to be standing on American soil in December 1941, watching the world split apart at the seams. War had been raging across Europe for over 2 years, tearing through cities and countryside alike. The Pacific was exploding into chaos as Japanese forces swept across islands and nations with terrifying speed. And then came Pearl Harbor, that single morning that changed everything, that forced America to stop watching from the sidelines and plunge headfirst into a conflict that would demand every ounce of the nation's strength, ingenuity, and industrial power. Within weeks, millions of young American men found themselves swept up in the greatest mobilization the country had ever seen. They came from farms in Iowa, from factories in Detroit, from colleges in California, from small towns scattered across every state. Most had never left their home counties before, let alone imagined they'd be shipped thousands of miles away to fight on frozen tundra, scorching deserts, steaming jungles, and remote islands they'd never heard of. The scale of it was staggering. This wasn't going to be a small expeditionary force. This was going to be millions of soldiers, sailors, and airmen scattered across every corner of the globe, fighting simultaneously on multiple continents in conditions that ranged from Arctic cold to tropical heat. But here's what nobody talks about enough in those dramatic war stories, in those black and white newsreels showing troops marching off to battle. Before a single shot could be fired, before any tank could roll or bomber could take off, there was a much more basic problem that had to be solved. These millions of men needed places to sleep. They needed shelter from rain, snow, wind, and sun. They needed protection from disease-carrying insects. They needed somewhere to store equipment, somewhere to eat meals, somewhere to receive medical treatment, somewhere to plan operations. In short, they needed buildings, and they needed them everywhere, all at once. Traditional military thinking suggested building wooden barracks, the same kind that had housed soldiers in previous wars. But that approach was already looking hopelessly outdated before the first American troops even shipped out. Think about the logistics for a moment. To build a single wooden barracks, you needed lumber, lots of it. You needed skilled carpenters who knew how to frame walls and lay roofs. You needed time, usually several weeks per structure. You needed tools, nails, and other hardware. Now multiply that by thousands of buildings needed across dozens of locations spread across the entire planet. The math simply didn't work. And then there was the shipping problem. Lumber is bulky and heavy. Loading enough wood to build even a modest base would consume precious cargo space on ships that were desperately needed to transport tanks, ammunition, fuel, food, medical supplies, and all the other necessities of war. Every cubic foot of ship space was contested territory, fought over by competing needs. The idea of filling hold after hold with boards and beams, while critical weapons sat on docks waiting for transport, was unthinkable. But the problems went even deeper than logistics. Consider where these troops were being sent. Many were headed to places where traditional construction was nearly impossible. Try building a wooden barracks on a tiny coral atoll in the Pacific, where the only level ground had to be bulldozed and where every plank of lumber would have to be shipped from thousands of miles away. Try constructing traditional buildings in the Aleutian Islands, where winds howled at hurricane force and where the ground was frozen solid for much of the year. Try erecting standard structures in the North African desert, where sandstorms could bury construction sites overnight, and where daytime temperatures could crack and warp wood. The military planners, staring at maps in Washington, knew they were facing something unprecedented. Previous wars had been fought in relatively confined areas. Even World War I, massive as it was, had been largely concentrated in Europe, with some activity in the Middle East and Africa. But this new war was truly global. American forces were going to need bases in Alaska and Australia, in North Africa and New Guinea, in Iceland and India, in Britain and Burma. Each location presented unique challenges of climate, terrain, and accessibility. What worked in one place might be useless in another. And there was another factor that weighed heavily on military minds, though it's something that often gets overlooked in the dramatic narratives of combat. Soldiers who were cold, wet, sick, or exhausted made terrible fighters. Morale collapsed when men had to sleep in mud. Disease ran rampant when troops lived in conditions that bred mosquitoes and rats. A soldier who spent his nights shivering in a leaky tent wasn't going to be sharp during the day. He'd make mistakes. He'd move slowly. He might miss the enemy soldier in the tree line or the mine in the road. The generals understood something fundamental, that comfort wasn't luxury, it was a military necessity. Housing wasn't an afterthought, it was a weapon. So as 1941 turned into 1942 and American mobilization kicked into high gear, the pressure mounted to find a solution. The traditional approach was failing before it even started. Wooden barracks couldn't be built fast enough, couldn't be shipped efficiently, and couldn't handle the extreme environments where American troops were heading. Something new was needed. Something revolutionary that could keep pace with the unprecedented scale and scope of this global conflict. The answer, when it came, would be so simple that it almost seemed too obvious. A curved shell of corrugated steel that could be packed flat, shipped anywhere, and assembled by men with basic tools in a matter of hours. But getting from the problem to that solution required a particular moment in time when military urgency met American industrial capability, when traditional thinking was thrown aside in favor of radical innovation, and when a handful of engineers working at a naval base in Rhode Island created something that would change not just the war, but the very concept of temporary construction. The United States Navy deserves credit for seeing the problem first. Even before Pearl Harbor forced America into the war, Navy planners were looking ahead with growing concern. The service was expanding rapidly, building new ships and recruiting new sailors at a pace not seen since World War I. All those new bases being constructed along American coastlines and on Pacific islands needed buildings, lots of them. The Navy had experimented with various solutions, including tents and temporary wooden structures, but nothing seemed adequate for what was coming. Naval officers had studied how the British handled similar problems during the First World War. The British had developed something called a Nissen hut, invented by a Canadian engineer named Peter Nissen in 1916. These structures used a semicircular design with corrugated iron sheets forming a curved roof and walls. They'd been used extensively in France and had proven reasonably effective. American military observers had seen them and recognized the basic soundness of the design. The curved shape was inherently strong, requiring no internal supports. The corrugated metal was weather-resistant and could shed rain and snow easily. The semicircular form meant wind would flow over the structure rather than pushing against flat walls. But American planners wanted something better suited to their own needs and manufacturing capabilities. The Nissen hut was good, but it wasn't quite right. It was designed for the muddy fields of France, not for tropical islands or Arctic outposts. The dimensions didn't match American standards for military housing. The assembly process required more skilled labor than the Navy wanted to depend on. Most importantly, American factories were different from British ones, with different capabilities and different manufacturing processes already in place for producing steel products. So in early 1941, months before America's official entry into the war, the Navy put out a call for a new design. They wanted something that could be mass-produced in American factories, shipped in standard cargo containers, and assembled quickly by relatively unskilled workers. The job went to the George A. Fuller Company, a major construction firm that had been around since the 1880s and had built some of America's most famous structures. Fuller assigned a team of architects and engineers to work at the Davisville Naval Construction Battalion Center in Rhode Island, right next to a place called Quonset Point. The location was significant. Quonset Point was being developed as a major naval air station, one of many new bases being rushed to completion as America prepared for the possibility of war. It was the perfect testing ground for new construction methods because it was an active construction site where new ideas could be tried immediately and where the people who would actually use these structures, Navy personnel and construction battalions, could provide instant feedback. The design team faced a fascinating challenge. They needed to create something that was essentially a building in a box. Every component had to be standardized so that any factory could produce the parts without special tools or training. The parts had to nest together efficiently for shipping, maximizing how many complete buildings could fit in a cargo ship. The assembly process had to be simple enough that it could be explained in a brief instruction sheet and executed by men who might have been farmers or shop clerks just weeks earlier. And the final structure had to be strong enough to stand up to whatever nature could throw at it, from typhoons to blizzards. The solution they developed was elegant in its simplicity. Start with a semicircular arch made from curved steel ribs. These ribs would form the skeleton of the building, providing the structural strength. Over these ribs, bolt sheets of corrugated steel, creating the skin of the structure. The corrugation itself added rigidity, while also creating channels for rain and snow to run off. At each end of the half-cylinder, install plywood panels that could be fitted with doors, windows, or vents as needed. Mount the whole thing on a simple wooden or concrete foundation to keep it off the ground and level it properly. That was it. No complicated joinery, no need for skilled carpenters, no special tools beyond wrenches and hammers. The first prototypes went up at Quonset Point in the summer of 1941. Navy personnel watched as small crews assembled the curved structures in a fraction of the time it would have taken to build a traditional wooden building. The simplicity was startling. The steel ribs came in sections that bolted together to form the arch. The corrugated panels overlapped and bolted to the ribs and to each other, creating a continuous weatherproof shell. The end panels could be customized on site, depending on whether the hut would be used as a barracks, office storage, or something else entirely. Those first huts proved the concept, but they also revealed areas for improvement. The initial design used a 16-foot width, but this proved cramped for many purposes. 6 men tried to sleep side by side in cots, quickly discovered that space was tight. So the engineers went back to the drawing board and expanded the design to 20 feet wide, giving much more usable interior space. Later, they developed even larger versions, some stretching to 40 feet in width, that could serve as mess halls or warehouses. But the real genius was in the details that might not be obvious at first glance. Every component was designed with shipping in mind. The steel panels nested together in crates, making efficient use of space. The bolts and fasteners came in numbered bags that corresponded to assembly steps. The wooden end panels could be cut to standard sizes that fit cargo ship dimensions. Even the instruction manuals were carefully designed, using simple diagrams that could be understood regardless of the reader's education level or native language. The modular nature of the design also meant incredible flexibility. Need a longer building? Just add more sections in the middle, extending the half-cylinder as far as needed. Want to connect multiple huts together? Cut doorways in the end panels and line them up. Need better insulation for cold climates? Add an inner lining of wood or insulating material. Want more ventilation for hot climates? Cut additional openings in the end panels or even in the curved walls. The basic design could be adapted to countless different uses without requiring major redesign or special parts. By late 1941, as tensions with Japan reached a breaking point, the Navy was already placing orders for thousands of these new structures. They'd been given the name Quonset huts after the place where they were first developed, and that name would stick throughout the war and beyond. The timing was remarkable. When Pearl Harbor was attacked on December 7th, 1941, the Quonset hut design was already locked in, and production was ramping up. The industrial machinery of America was about to prove its worth, and these humble steel shelters would be one of its most unexpected triumphs. What happened next was a demonstration of American manufacturing power that still seems incredible today. The country that had spent the 1930s struggling through economic depression suddenly transformed into an industrial juggernaut. Factories that had been making cars started making tanks. Plants that produced appliances switched to ammunition. Shipyards that built freighters began launching Liberty ships at a rate of one per day. And scattered across the country, dozens of facilities started cranking out Quonset huts by the thousands. The production process was pure assembly line efficiency. The same principles Henry Ford had pioneered for automobiles now applied to buildings. Workers at steel mills rolled out corrugated sheets and cut them to precise specifications. Presses stamped out connecting plates and brackets. Other facilities cut lumber for the end panels and foundations. Everything was designed around standard measurements so that parts from different factories would be interchangeable. A steel rib made in New Jersey would fit perfectly with panels made in Ohio and end pieces made in Michigan. The numbers are staggering when you really sit with them. In 1942 alone, the Navy ordered more than 25,000 huts. That's not total over the course of the war, that's in a single year, and production kept accelerating. By 1943, entire factories were dedicated to nothing but Quonset hut production, running multiple shifts around the clock. Workers, many of them women who had taken jobs in war industries as men shipped overseas, became experts at assembling the component kits with speed and precision. Each complete Quonset hut kit weighed about 5 tons when crated for shipping. That might sound heavy, but consider what you got for that weight. A complete building, roughly 20 feet wide and 36 feet long in the standard version, with over 700 square feet of floor space. Compare that to shipping enough lumber to build a similar-sized wooden structure, which would weigh considerably more and take up much more cargo space, because boards couldn't be nested as efficiently as flat steel panels. The logistics network that moved these huts around the world was itself a marvel of organization. Completed kits went from factories to ports, where they were loaded onto cargo ships heading to war zones. The ships carrying huts often carried other critical supplies as well, making efficient use of every bit of cargo capacity. A Liberty ship might have huts stacked in one hold, jeeps in another, ammunition in a third, and rations in a fourth. Everything moving together toward the front lines. And those front lines were everywhere. Pacific Islands needed huts for air bases being carved out of jungles. North Africa needed them for supply depots in the desert. Britain needed them for the massive buildup of American forces preparing for the invasion of Europe. Alaska needed them for bases protecting against potential Japanese attack through the Aleutians. Every theater of war had different requirements, but the same basic Quonset hut design could meet all of them with minor modifications. One of the most remarkable aspects of the production effort was how quickly it could respond to changing needs. When commanders in the field reported that standard huts weren't quite right for a particular purpose, engineers could design modifications and get them into production within weeks. Need better ventilation for tropical use? Add louvered vents to the end panels? Need stronger foundations for areas with high winds? Include heavier anchor bolts in the kit? Need blackout capabilities for areas subject to air raids? Include materials for light, tight window covers? The diversity of uses kept expanding as the war progressed. Yes, huts served as barracks for sleeping quarters, but that was just the beginning. Medical corpsmen set up field hospitals in linked chains of huts, creating wards for wounded soldiers with operating rooms, recovery areas, and administrative offices, all under curved steel roofs. Supply officers used huts as warehouses, stacking them with everything from boots to bullets. Communications specialists installed radio equipment in huts, creating the nerve centers that coordinated vast military operations. Pilots got flight briefings in huts. Cooks served meals from huts. Chaplains held services in huts fitted with crude altars and rough-hewn pews. Some specialized variants emerged for specific purposes. The Navy developed versions with extra reinforcement for use as ammunition bunkers, where the curved steel provided excellent blast resistance. The Army created versions with heavy insulation and double walls for Arctic conditions. There were even versions designed as portable workshops, complete with workbenches and tool storage built into the design. By the war's midpoint in 1943, Quonset huts had become so ubiquitous that they barely rated mention in military reports. They were just part of the infrastructure, as expected and unremarkable as tents or foxholes. But that very ordinariness was a testament to how well they worked. When something becomes invisible because it's so reliably present, you know it's serving its purpose. The total production by war's end exceeded 100,000 units. Think about what that represents. At 700 square feet per hut, that's over 70 million square feet of enclosed space, enough to house several small cities worth of people. And that was built, shipped and installed in just 4 years, much of it in the most hostile and remote environments on Earth. American allies received thousands of huts through various assistance programs. British forces used them across their empire. Australian troops had them in the Pacific. Even the Soviets received some for use in their Far Eastern territories. The design was so obviously superior to alternatives that it spread far beyond just American military use. What made this mass production possible wasn't just factory capacity, though America certainly had plenty of that. It was the standardization, the relentless focus on making every hut identical to every other hut. This meant that workers became incredibly efficient at their jobs because they did the same tasks over and over. It meant that ships could be loaded quickly because stevedores knew exactly how hut crates were packed and how they nested together. It meant that construction crews could assemble huts almost blindfolded because the process never varied. And perhaps most importantly, it meant that when a hut was damaged in a storm or by enemy action, replacement parts could be shipped in and installed without any custom fabrication. A dented panel could be unbolted and a new one bolted in its place. A damaged end wall could be replaced with a spare from stock. This repairability extended the useful life of the huts far beyond what might have been expected for temporary structures. The factories producing huts became sources of pride for their communities. Towns held rallies celebrating production milestones. Workers competed to see which shift could assemble the most kits in a week. The huts might not have had the glamour of bombers or battleships, but everyone understood they were just as critical to the war effort. A soldier without shelter was a soldier who couldn't fight, and these factories were making sure that wouldn't happen. By 1945, when victory finally came, the production lines were still running. The end of the war came suddenly enough that thousands of huts were still in crates, either in warehouses or already loaded on ships. Some never made it to their intended destinations. They'd be sold as surplus instead, beginning the hut's second life in peacetime. But we're getting ahead of the story. First, we need to understand what it was actually like to live in these steel half-cylinders scattered across the world's battlefields. For the average American soldier arriving at a new base in the Pacific or Europe or North Africa, the first sight of those distinctive curved roofs often brought a mixture of relief and resignation. Relief because it meant actual shelter, walls, and a roof instead of just a tent. Resignation because everyone quickly learned that Quonset huts were far from luxurious and came with their own unique discomforts. Step inside a typical Quonset hut being used as a barracks, and you'd find yourself in a space that was simultaneously spacious and cramped. The curved walls meant you had plenty of headroom in the center, where the ceiling might be 10 feet high or more. But as you moved toward the edges, that curve meant you couldn't stand up straight. The usable floor space was good, but it wasn't rectangular like a normal room, and that took some getting used to. Rows of metal frame cots lined the walls, usually arranged perpendicular to the long axis of the hut. This was the most efficient use of space and kept the center aisle clear. Each man had a cot, a footlocker for his personal gear, and maybe a small shelf or hook on the wall. That was it. Privacy was non-existent. Sound echoed off the metal walls, so every snore, every cough, every nightmare-induced shout was shared by everyone in the hut. Light from a single bulb hung from the ceiling, casting shadows that made the curved walls seem to close in at night. The climate inside a Quonset hut varied wildly depending on where you were and what modifications had been made. In the Pacific Islands, the bare metal shells could turn into ovens during the day. The tropical sun beating down on corrugated steel created a greenhouse effect that left men drenched in sweat even when sitting still. Crews learned to add insulation, lining the interior walls with whatever material they could scrounge. Some huts got fancy treatment with actual insulation batting. Others made do with cardboard, palm fronds, or even layers of burlap. Anything to create an air gap between the hot outer shell and the living space. Ventilation was critical in hot climates. The standard hut design included vents in the end panels, but that often wasn't enough. Industrious soldiers would cut additional openings, sometimes violating regulations but keeping themselves from heat exhaustion. Screens over these openings kept out mosquitoes and other insects, though in practice the screens were often torn or missing, and insects found their way in regardless. More than one soldier woke to find his mosquito netting shredded and his body covered in bites. In colder climates, the problems reversed. Those same metal walls that trapped heat in the tropics conducted it away in freezing weather. A Quonset hut, without heating in the Aleutians or Northern Europe, would quickly match the outside temperature, leaving men shivering in their sleeping bags. The solution was stoves, usually pot-bellied coal or wood burners placed at either end of the hut. These created wild temperature gradients. Men near the stoves roasted while those at the far end froze. Musical chairs with cot assignments became a constant negotiation. The wooden floors helped, keeping men off the ground and providing some insulation. But in wet climates, those floors could become damp and even rot if maintenance lagged. In muddy areas, keeping the huts clean was a constant battle. Soldiers tracked in dirt and mud that accumulated despite regular sweeping. Some bases installed wooden walkways or gravel paths between huts, but in the worst locations, you'd be ankle-deep in mud the moment you stepped out the door. Rain was perhaps the most challenging weather condition for hut dwellers. The curved metal roof did shed water effectively, but it also amplified the sound. A gentle shower became a deafening drum roll on the corrugated steel. Heavy tropical downpours turned the interior into an echo chamber where conversation was impossible and sleep was difficult. Some men got used to it and could sleep through anything. Others never adjusted and spent rainy nights awake and miserable. Leaks were inevitable. The panels were designed to overlap and shed water, but seals degraded over time. Salt spray in coastal locations corroded the metal. Expansion and contraction from temperature changes worked fasteners loose. Where panels met end walls was a particular weak point. Many huts developed reliable drips that had to be caught in buckets or helmets. Bored soldiers would name the leaks and take bets on which would drip first when rain started. Despite these discomforts, the huts served their purpose admirably. They were infinitely better than tents in storms. They provided real protection from the elements. They could be heated, at least partially. They gave men a sense of having a home base, a place to return to that didn't change from day to day. And critically, they worked anywhere. The same basic design housed men in the Aleutians where temperatures dropped below zero, and in New Guinea where it never got below 80 degrees. Beyond barracks, the versatility of the huts shone through in their other uses. A field hospital set up in a chain of huts could function remarkably well. The curved ceiling gave doctors and nurses room to work. The open interior meant cots could be arranged for efficient patient care. The steel structure could be scrubbed clean, important for preventing infection. Multiple huts could be connected to create separate wards, an operating theatre, a pharmacy, and administrative offices. Mess halls filled huts with the smells of cooking food, which was wonderful when the food was good and less wonderful when it wasn't. Long tables and benches filled the interior. A serving line set up at one end dished out meals to men filing through with their trays. The curved walls created interesting acoustic effects where conversations from one end of the hut could be heard clearly at the other end, which made for some awkward moments and some entertaining eavesdropping. Command centers operated out of huts equipped with maps, radio gear, and desks for officers. These were usually better appointed than barracks, with wooden partitions creating separate offices and some degree of privacy. Communications huts bristled with antennas outside and hummed with radio equipment inside. Some of the most important decisions of the war were made in buildings that looked like overgrown tin cans from the outside. The flexibility of the design meant that creative soldiers could adapt huts for almost any purpose. There were huts converted into movie theaters, with a projector at one end and men sitting on the floor, watching Hollywood films that were months old by the time they arrived. There were huts serving as libraries, stocked with donated books and magazines that were read until they fell apart. There were huts used as canteens where soldiers could buy small luxuries like cigarettes and candy. There were even huts that became chapels with someone's handcrafted altar at one end and rough benches providing seating for men seeking solace in prayer. Some bases grew into small cities of huts, with hundreds of the structures arranged in orderly rows with streets between them. Signs went up naming the streets, usually after places back home or after fallen comrades. A sense of community developed in these hut villages. Men knew which hut was home, which one had the best card games, which one housed the officers to avoid, which one had the chaplain who'd listen to your problems. Personal touches accumulated despite regulations against modifying government property. Men painted or carved their names, their girlfriends' names, their hometowns. Pin-up girls appeared on walls. Photos from home got tucked into the ribs of the ceiling. Small shelves were fashioned from scrap wood. Curtains appeared around some cots, offering an illusion of privacy. The huts that started as identical mass-produced structures gradually took on individual character. Life in a Quonset hut meant adapting to communal living at a level most Americans had never experienced. You learned who snored, who talked in their sleep, who got up multiple times per night to use the latrine. You learned to sleep through the sounds of 20 or 30 other men breathing, shifting, occasionally crying out. You learned to keep your valuables locked up and your eyes on your gear. You learned the complex social hierarchies that developed, who had seniority, who had influence, who you could trust. Letters written home from Quonset huts paint a picture of this daily life. Men complained about the heat, the cold, the noise, the lack of privacy. But they also expressed gratitude for having real shelter. A roof that didn't blow away in storms, walls that kept out at least some of the insects. Many letters mentioned the distinctive curved shape, describing it to family members who'd never seen anything like it. Some soldiers drew sketches in their letters, showing the half-cylinder form and trying to convey what it was like to live in such an unusual structure. For men who'd grown up in farmhouses or city apartments or suburban homes, the Quonset hut was completely alien architecture. There were no square corners, no attic, no basement, no hallways, just one big curving space that served all functions. It was disorienting at first, But humans are adaptable creatures, and soldiers particularly so. What seemed strange and uncomfortable in the first days became normal and even familiar over time. Some soldiers developed genuine affection for their huts. These steel shelters had kept them dry through monsoons, warm through cold nights, safe through air raids. The huts became associated with survival, with fellowship, with the rare moments of peace in wartime. Decades later, veterans would describe their huts with surprising fondness, remembering the men they'd lived with more than the discomforts they'd endured. The global distribution of Quonset huts created a strange uniformity across vastly different landscapes. A soldier transferring from the South Pacific to Europe might find himself in a nearly identical hut, creating a sense of continuity in the midst of chaos. The huts became a symbol of American presence, instantly recognizable to friend and foe alike. In the Pacific Theater, huts dotted island after island as American forces island-hopped toward Japan. Tiny atolls that had been empty coral and sand suddenly sprouted forests of curved steel roofs. Guadalcanal, where some of the war's fiercest fighting took place, became a massive American base with thousands of huts, housing everything from air wings to supply depots to hospitals. The huts stood resilient through tropical storms that flattened tents and turned dirt roads into rivers of mud. New Guinea, with its combination of mountains, jungle and swamps, presented unique challenges for any construction. Traditional buildings would have required clearing massive amounts of vegetation and creating level ground. Quonset huts could work with rougher terrain, their curved bottoms adapting to slightly uneven foundations better than rectangular structures. Bases there used huts extensively, creating American outposts in some of the world's most hostile environments. As the Pacific Campaign rolled closer to Japan, newer island bases were established with startling speed. Iwo Jima and Okinawa, scenes of desperate battles, were quickly transformed into major staging areas. Quonset huts appeared almost before the shooting stopped, providing shelter and infrastructure for the forces that would have invaded Japan if the atomic bombs hadn't ended the war first. Construction battalions, the famous Seabees, became experts at clearing ground and erecting huts under the most difficult conditions, sometimes while still under sporadic enemy fire. The European theatre saw equally extensive use of huts, though in different conditions. Britain filled with American forces in 1942 and 1943 as the build-up for D-Day progressed. Air bases across England used Quonset huts for everything, from housing bomber crews to storing spare parts for B-17. The British climate, with its constant rain and damp cold, was in some ways harder on the huts than tropical heat. Rust became a constant enemy, requiring regular maintenance and painting to keep the structures sound. After the Normandy invasion in June 1944, huts followed the advancing Allied armies across France. They appeared at supply depots, field hospitals, and headquarters facilities. As the front lines moved east, the huts moved with them, providing infrastructure for the massive logistical effort needed to keep millions of men supplied and ready to fight. Some ended up in places where traditional stone buildings still stood, creating odd contrasts between medieval architecture and 20th century military expediency. The Battle of the Bulge in winter, 1944-45, tested the huts under conditions they weren't really designed for. Heavy snow loads could damage huts that weren't properly maintained, and the bitter cold made heating them nearly impossible without multiple stoves. But they still provided better shelter than alternatives, and many soldiers credited their Quonset huts with saving their lives during that brutal winter. North Africa had seen huts early in the American involvement there. The desert presented its own challenges, with sandstorms that could strip paint and pit metal, extreme temperature swings between scorching days and frigid nights, and the constant problem of sand infiltration. Huts in North Africa often required extra reinforcement and foundation work to prevent them from being undermined by shifting sand. Less well-known but equally impressive was the deployment of huts in Alaska and the Aleutian Islands. The US military built major bases in some of the most remote and harsh environments on Earth, places where winter temperatures could drop to 40 degrees Fahrenheit below zero, and where winds regularly exceeded hurricane force. Huts there required the heaviest modifications, with extra insulation, reinforced structures to handle snow loads and wind pressure, and carefully designed heating systems. The fact that Quonset huts worked even in these conditions spoke to the robustness of the basic design. Some locations saw huts used in creative combinations with natural terrain. In the Aleutians, some huts were partially buried in hillsides for extra protection from wind and cold. In the Pacific, huts were sometimes placed among existing trees for camouflage from air reconnaissance. In mountainous areas, huts were terraced into slopes, creating multi-level base complexes. The global spread of the huts meant that by 1945, you could find them on every continent except Antarctica. They'd become one of the most widely distributed products of American manufacturing, more widespread even than jeeps or sea rations. Anywhere American forces operated, the distinctive curved profile would appear, often within days of troops arriving. Allied nations adopted the design enthusiastically. The British manufactured their own versions, slightly modified to match their production capabilities. Australian forces in the Pacific used American-supplied huts extensively. Canadian troops in Europe had them at their bases. Even the Soviet Union received some for use in their Far Eastern territories, though whether they actually employed them is unclear from historical records. The huts also became a kind of currency in military politics. Senior officers competed for allocations of huts for their commands. Having adequate huts meant being able to house your men properly, which meant better morale and readiness. Commands that were short of huts had to make do with tents or requisitioned buildings, putting them at a disadvantage. The humble hut thus became entangled in the complex web of military hierarchy and resource allocation. Interestingly, enemy forces sometimes captured intact huts when they overran American positions early in the war. The Japanese reportedly studied captured huts with interest, though their own industrial capacity and design philosophy led them to continue using different approaches to temporary construction. The Germans, ever technically minded, examined captured huts and apparently drew some inspiration for their own prefabricated structure designs, though they never matched the scale of American production. Civilian populations in areas where American forces operated had mixed reactions to the huts. To some, they represented American power and wealth, the ability to mass-produce buildings and scatter them across the globe. To others, they were eyesores, industrial intrusions in traditional landscapes. Children in liberated European towns were often fascinated by the curved structures so different from local architecture. In the Pacific, indigenous populations sometimes received surplus huts from American forces and incorporated them into their own communities, creating interesting cultural hybrids. The sheer number of huts and their wide distribution created an unintended effect. They served as markers of American reach and capability. Enemy intelligence could track American movements and estimate force sizes by counting huts visible in reconnaissance photos. Conversely, American forces sometimes erected dummy huts to deceive enemy observers about the size and location of bases, creating entire fake installations with empty huts as props. By the time Germany surrendered in May 1945, Quonset huts had become such an integral part of military infrastructure that few people even thought about them consciously. They were just part of the landscape of war, as ubiquitous as helmets and rifles. The same would be true after Japan's surrender in August. Huts had housed, sheltered, and supported millions of men through years of global conflict. But their story was far from over. The end of the war would bring an unexpected new chapter, one where these temporary military structures would find permanent homes in peacetime America. When the war ended, the United States faced an immediate and enormous question: what to do with millions of tons of military equipment suddenly rendered surplus? Ships, planes, tanks, trucks, weapons, supplies of every imaginable type, all sitting idle now that they weren't needed for fighting. Among this vast inventory of surplus material were tens of thousands of Quonset huts, some still overseas, some already shipped back to America, some still in warehouses waiting to be deployed. The obvious answer was to sell them off or scrap them for their material value. And indeed, many huts did get dismantled, their steel recycled for peacetime uses. But the timing of this surplus coincided with another national crisis, one that the Quonset hut would prove surprisingly well-suited to address. America in 1945 and 1946 faced a severe housing shortage. Millions of servicemen were returning home all at once, eager to start or restart civilian lives. Many wanted to marry, start families, settle down, but there simply weren't enough homes for them. The Great Depression and then the war had halted most residential construction for 15 years. The housing stock was old, inadequate, and in many cities severely overcrowded. Making matters worse, the GI Bill was sending hundreds of thousands of veterans to college, and universities were completely unprepared for this influx. Most schools had been operating with reduced enrollments during the war. Now suddenly, they had more applicants than they could possibly house in existing dormitories. Someone, and history isn't entirely clear who first had the idea, realized that surplus Quonset huts could solve both problems at once. Huts could house veterans and their families. They could serve as temporary dormitories for students. They were available immediately, didn't require new construction, and were cheap. Veterans who'd lived in huts during the war might not love the idea of living in them again, but it beat having no housing at all. Universities moved first. The University of Wisconsin, University of Michigan, UCLA, and dozens of other schools purchased surplus huts and erected entire villages for married student veterans. These weren't just rows of barracks. They were converted into apartments, with partitions creating separate bedrooms, small kitchens installed at one end, and shared bathroom facilities nearby. It was cramped and basic, but it was housing. The students and their families who lived in these hut villages created tight-knit communities. Everyone was in the same boat. Young families trying to make it through school on GI Bill money, living in surplus military structures. Children played in the spaces between huts. Wives swapped babysitting duties and recipes for cheap meals. Study groups formed, with students moving between huts to work on assignments together. The shared hardship of Quonset living created bonds that many remembered fondly for the rest of their lives. Some schools got creative with their hut villages. They added landscaping to make the areas more attractive. They connected huts with covered walkways. They set up community centers in larger huts where residents could gather for social events. The best-managed villages took on a sense of permanence, even though everyone knew they were supposed to be temporary. Of course, living in a Quonset hut as a married couple with young children was quite different from being a soldier in a barracks. The lack of soundproofing meant everyone heard everyone else's business. Babies crying in one hut would wake neighbors in adjacent huts. The thin walls meant winter heating bills were brutal, and summer air conditioning, where it existed at all, struggled to keep up. Wives who'd imagined post-war life in suburban homes with yards and picket fences found themselves instead in curved steel shells that leaked when it rained. Yet these hut villages served their purpose. They kept roofs over heads through the critical years when the baby boom was just beginning and when the massive expansion of American higher education was getting underway. Many of the men who would go on to become leaders in business, science, and government spent crucial years living with their young families in Quonset huts, studying for degrees that would launch their careers. Beyond universities, whole communities of huts sprang up to house veterans and their families. Some cities built entire neighborhoods of huts, temporary housing projects that were supposed to last a few years until conventional homes could be constructed. Some of these hut communities persisted much longer than intended. The residents fixed them up, added gardens, painted them, made them as home-like as possible. In some cases, the temporary hut communities lasted a decade or more. Churches saw potential in surplus huts too. Rural and suburban congregations that needed more space but couldn't afford new construction bought huts and converted them into chapels. The curved ceiling created interesting acoustics that worked surprisingly well for hymn singing. Some congregations still worship in buildings that started as military surplus Quonset huts 70 years ago, now so modified and renovated that the original structure is barely recognizable. American pragmatism and inventiveness transformed huts into businesses. Small manufacturers set up shop in huts that provided cheap space for operations. Garages and auto repair shops found the curved shape perfect for their needs, with plenty of overhead clearance and open floor plans. Farmers loved them for equipment storage and as barns, appreciating the same durability that had made them useful in war zones. Some entrepreneurial uses were downright creative. Diners and restaurants opened in huts, the distinctive curved shape becoming part of the appeal. Dance halls and nightclubs took over huts, the curved walls and ceiling creating interesting acoustics for music. Bowling alleys found the long, narrow form perfect for lanes. Some huts became homes, not just temporarily but permanently, with owners gradually transforming them through additions and modifications until they looked like conventional houses with a weirdly curved core. The civilian repurposing of Quonset huts wasn't limited to America. Overseas, huts left behind by departing American forces entered local economies. In the Philippines, Guam and Pacific Islands, huts became schools, clinics, stores and homes. Some countries dismantled huts and shipped them to where they were needed most. Britain sold off American huts to address its own severe post-war housing crisis. In some cases, communities of huts in Europe and Asia became permanent settlements, housing displaced persons and refugees for years. Not everyone was happy with the transformation of military surplus into civilian use. Critics pointed out that living in a Quonset hut was hardly the comfortable post-war life that veterans had been promised. The structures were never meant for permanent family housing, lacked proper insulation, and were frankly ugly. Neighborhoods of huts depressed property values in surrounding areas. Some civic leaders fought against allowing hut communities in their cities, seeing them as embarrassing reminders of wartime expediency. But practical necessity overrode aesthetic concerns. The housing shortage was real and severe. Conventional construction couldn't keep pace with demand. Quonset huts, whatever their faults, were available immediately and affordable. For many families, they represented not failure, but opportunity, a chance to get started on post-war life, even if the accommodations weren't ideal. Maintenance of civilian huts proved challenging. The structures had been designed for relatively short-term military use, not for decades of family living. Rust became a constant problem, especially in humid climates. The corrugated steel conducted heat and cold efficiently, making climate control difficult and expensive. Leaks developed and were hard to seal permanently. Some huts were maintained beautifully by conscientious owners. Others deteriorated rapidly into eyesores. By the 1950s, as the economy boomed and conventional housing construction finally caught up with demand, many Quonset hut communities were dismantled. Families moved into real houses with square corners and proper bedrooms. Universities tore down hut villages and built proper dormitories. But not all huts disappeared. Enough found permanent niches that even today you can still spot them scattered across the American landscape. Some of the surviving huts have historic value now. They're preserved as reminders of the wartime emergency production effort and the post-war housing crisis. A few have been restored to period condition and serve as museums or educational exhibits. Others continue in the utilitarian roles they've filled for decades, quietly doing the job they were designed for 80 years ago. The story of Quonset huts in civilian use illustrates something important about American culture. There's a deep pragmatism, a willingness to use whatever works, regardless of whether it's elegant or conventional. The huts worked, so people used them. They weren't ashamed to live in surplus military structures if that meant having a home. That practical flexibility, that ability to adapt and make do, helped carry the nation through the difficult transition from wartime mobilization to peacetime prosperity. Today, decades after the last original wartime Quonset hut rolled off a production line, the design refuses to die. Modern companies manufacture Quonset-style buildings using updated materials and methods but following the same basic semicircular arch design. These contemporary versions serve as workshops, storage buildings, garages, and even homes for people who appreciate the strength, simplicity, and efficiency of the form. The legacy of the Quonset hut extends beyond just the physical structures that still stand. It represents a particular moment in American history when industrial capability, design ingenuity, and practical necessity combined to create something genuinely useful. The hut solved real problems during the war and continued solving different problems afterward. It proved that good design can be simple design and that temporary solutions sometimes become permanent because they work better than expected. For the generation that came of age during World War II, whether they served in the military or waited at home, Quonset huts became part of their collective experience. Veterans remembered them as the backdrop of wartime life. Students remembered them as where they started families while earning degrees. Children of the post-war years remembered playing around them, those curved metal buildings that looked like nothing else in their neighborhoods. Architects and urban planners have studied the Quonset hut phenomenon for lessons about mass housing, modular construction, and prefabricated building systems. The basic insight that you can ship buildings in pieces and assemble them on site quickly and cheaply has informed countless subsequent designs. Modern manufactured housing, from mobile homes to modular construction systems, owes intellectual debts to the principles that made Quonset huts successful. The environmental movement has found interesting value in Quonset huts too. The curved form is inherently efficient, using less material to enclose space than rectangular buildings. The steel is recyclable. Some modern eco-conscious builders have embraced Quonset-style construction as a green building method, appreciating the material efficiency and durability that made the original designs work so well. Cultural historians point to Quonset huts as artifacts that tell stories about American industrialization, about military logistics, about post-war social change. They appear in photographs from the war years and the post-war period, usually in backgrounds, unremarked but ubiquitous. They show up in movies and documentaries, instantly recognizable symbols of military life. They appear in oral histories, with veterans describing their hutmates and the communities they formed in those curved steel shelters. Some people have developed genuine affection for the Quonset aesthetic, the clean simplicity of the half-cylinder form. Artists have painted them, photographers have documented them, preservationists have fought to save particularly historic examples from demolition. There are people who actively seek out and restore old Quonset huts, treating them as architectural treasures worth preserving. The fact that we're still talking about Quonset huts 80 years after they were developed speaks to their impact. They weren't just another wartime expedient that disappeared when peace came. They were a genuine innovation that left permanent marks on the built environment and on cultural memory. They proved that American industrial creativity could produce more than just weapons and machines. It could produce solutions to problems that no one had quite articulated before. In the final analysis, the Quonset Hut story is about more than just buildings. It's about American confidence in facing enormous challenges, about the industrial capacity that made victory possible, about the ability to produce massive quantities of functional equipment rapidly, and about the unexpected ways that wartime innovations can find peacetime applications. It's a story about ordinary people living in extraordinary times, making do with what they had, adapting to circumstances they never imagined they'd face. Those curved steel structures scattered across the world weren't glamorous, they weren't comfortable, they weren't beautiful by conventional standards, but they worked, and in the end, that mattered more than anything else. They kept millions of men dry, housed students when universities overflowed, sheltered families when housing was scarce, and continued serving countless purposes long after their supposed temporary usefulness should have expired. The next time you drive past an old Quonset hut, maybe rusting in a field or still serving as someone's garage or workshop, take a moment to appreciate what you're seeing. That humble structure represents a thread connecting back to one of history's most dramatic moments, when America mobilized its full strength to fight a global war and had to invent new solutions to problems on a scale never seen before. That particular hut might not have sheltered troops in the Pacific or students on a post-war campus, but its design siblings certainly did, and together they formed an infrastructure that helped change the world. It's a remarkable legacy for something that was supposed to be temporary, a testament to the power of simple, practical design executed on an ambitious scale. The Quonset hut wasn't meant to be remembered, but perhaps that's exactly why it deserves to be, because the unglamorous innovations, the practical solutions to everyday problems, often matter just as much as the celebrated inventions and dramatic breakthroughs that fill history books.